Ho, stop, hardwerkende jonge dame. Herken je dat? Het financiële nieuws bijhouden, dat is wel het laatste waar je tijd en moeite in wil stoppen. Je hebt wel iets beters te doen, namelijk je leven leiden. Bij Peaks beleg je zelf terwijl je je leven leeft. Want slim, makkelijk en haast ongemerkt beleggen doe je bij Peaks. Je kan starten zonder kennis van beleggen en al inleggen vanaf €1. Sluit je nu aan bij de nieuwe beleggers. Ga naar peaks.nl, download de Peaks-app en ontvang €10 startegoed met code PEAKS10. Peaks. Echt eenvoudig beleggen voor iedereen. Weet dat je met beleggen risico neemt en je een deel van je inleg kunt verliezen.
Of je nu minder vlees eet, taalmaatje bent of de straat op gaat, je zet je in voor een betere wereld. Maar doet je geld dat ook? Bij Triodos Bank zetten we geld in actie. Enkel en alleen voor een betere wereld. Voor meer biologische landbouw, menselijke zorg, schone energie en kunst en cultuur. Zet je geld ook in actie. Kom sparen bij Triodos Bank. Ga naar triodos.nl/geldinactie.
You are about to listen to an English episode of VSR about expats in the Netherlands. We originally recorded the episode in Dutch, as we always do, but we also wanted expats themselves to be able to listen to this. So that's why we used AI to translate the episode into English. It is far from perfect, we know that, but it is good enough for you to understand the main points and arguments. So we hope you enjoy this semi-perfect English episode and are curious to know what you think of it.
I think, when we talk about expats, I'd say there's two kinds really, right? They're the ones that make the effort and ones that don't.
Yeah, I've heard cut expat a million times. Yes. So I've had it when I've been cycling. Say if I did something wrong on the bike and they see me on a swap feets, so they know full well that I live here and they hear me speak in English, they put one and one together.
Welcome to VSR, formerly Schaamteloos Randstedelijk, the podcast about everything you are but don't want to be. My name is Doortje Smithuizen. Across from me sits Perry van der Brink. And like every week, we hold up a mirror to our listeners and explore paradoxical relationships with the systems around us.
Once we saw them as the ideal helpers to become the best knowledge economy in the world. But today, we seem to see them mostly as people who let housing prices rise, have no intention of integrating and enjoy unfair tax benefits. Today is about the changing attitude we seem to have toward expats. But first, the news column.
Yes, I actually had two current events that, for me, a connection. So two things that I read in the newspapers last weekend. One was I thought, very good opinion piece by Vincent Colenbrander. I know him a little bit because he works for a lot of talk shows. So he calls me on a regular basis. Yes.
Yeah. Nice
relationship.
argument.
Very nice. Well, we have a good call-off relationship, I think, Vincent and I. Yes, let me just say that on behalf of the two of us. But he wrote I thought, really good article. An opinion article on childcare. And the title was Working Becomes for the Rich. And he described very well, and especially for me as someone without children, it is always shocking to read, how much he spends on 2 days of childcare for his 1-year-old daughter. And he actually identified how that actually only widens the gap between rich and poor. Because he described, yes, if you really earn a lot, then you can easily make 1,000 or 1,500 euros a month. So a lot of money for everybody. But if you really earn a lot of money, you can slate that easier than if you earn less money. And well, for him, they then really have to get that money together for that shelter with a lot of art and flying. And for people who earn even less, of course, that's even harder. And what he shows, well, to my mind, is actually how that middle class is very much eroded at this point. So there is, for lower people who earn less, there is allowances. That's also a system that has quite a few snags, we know by now. But there is. But for someone like him who just earns reasonably well, it's just a very expensive thing.
Yes.
So he actually showed that so working becomes almost a kind of privilege, working full time then. On the other hand, I read an article in NRC, and it actually expanded on a theme that I also touched on a bit earlier in the Volkskrant, which is that millennials, suburban millennials, they put off having children for a long time, and many of them then get a dog because they do have some kind of care needs and feel like having a family. Yes, they famously want to take care of something anyway. So then what do? Then they take one of those very complicated purebred dogs. The author of this piece also had one of those with one of those, some Japanese names
I
or
looked
something.
up some more.
Right, well, not
I'm
very
reminded
well.
of my old job where at one point we just had to come up with a dog policy because there were just too many people bringing these kind of Instagram dogs to the office.
Good. And it's also a tried and true remedy for depression. So I also got the idea of those 30-somethings who just experience incredible existential panic and then just get a dog like that to solve that. Yeah, right. Then what naturally arises, because so then you have a whole kind of class with too much time, too much money, a kind of unmet care need that has nowhere to go. Then they take that dog, but so a whole economy is also created around that. So that author of the piece described, who then does dog yoga with the dog. They've been on dog body language courses. You can buy dog puzzles by now, which you then do together with your dog. Cozy. There are now also in Amsterdam apparently a kind of Zoho houses for dogs. So you have dogs, Dog Society Hot Dog House. That's where she would go with those dogs. And I thought, yes, actually, I actually see how Vincent can be solved by actually that dog economy. Because that Dog Society Hot Dog House, so that was a dog shelter where you then take your dog. And then is then cared for by all very enthusiastic dog lovers. But it's also an educational environment where you can do courses with your dog, deep breathing together with your dog. And that's with $25 a day.
Basically just hear all the characteristics that my child had in childcare.
Can we put the kids in the hot dog house?
Is a lot cheaper than the...
Yeah, that's $25 a day.
Daycare. I think it costs between 8 and 9 euros per hour. We really pay a hefty amount for that indeed. On the one hand, I hate that system of progressive payment. I work hard, so I earn pretty okay. But because of that, I pay a lot of childcare. And you get caught at some point. I do recognize that from that piece in a kind of system. Okay, so working less, then I can't afford this anymore. So it also feeds a kind of traditional role pattern.
Yeah, totally. And what he describes, if they worked one more day, then they would earn more. So they have to pay more for childcare. So it's kind of a vicious situation.
I think that tipping point is really kind of in the lower middle income. Yes, exactly. But that it's almost no longer lucrative to bring in more childcare. That it's just more expensive net than working less. No, wait a minute, yes. That working less is actually then more lucrative
for
than
some
childcare.
People, again, I kind of foresee where this is going. So then the parents are going to bring the kids to the dog club. Then people are going to complain about the dogs and how they behave. Then the dogs are going to be discriminated against in their own hot dog house. And that's going to create a whole new defeat again. That's going to create
Protest
a new
movements.
divide actually again.
And then in the end, Sander and the dog gap. Yes, who
also has a
make
dog
it
and a child. Well, ideal. We're going to produce him right away.
System
He's
of it.
around.
Yes, I Was Human. He did a broadcast on advertorials and press freedom. And there he showed a clip that DPG had recorded. DPG, publisher of all kinds of media, including big newspapers like Volkskrant and NRC.
Only in Volkskrant.
Oh, yes, that's Media House, of course,
NRC's
yes.
Media?
But in any case, a very big publisher. And they make a video which is sent out to advertisers about branded content. And in it, that branded content is actually touted as if it were nativer than native. So it's just indistinguishable from native. They really say that. Yes.
They literally say that.
Nativer than nativer than native.
No, it's indistinguishable from real. Nobody says, no, it's from occasionally. Not.
No, they really say from. I think maybe we should give him a little bit of a listen.
With branded content, you bring the story in a journalistic and therefore reliable way. The commercial message is subtly incorporated into an editorial-looking article. The article appears among other editorial articles and therefore has a professional and credible appearance. A branded article or advertorial is an advertisement that resembles a news article, therefore very suitable to inform. It is often not immediately obvious to the customer that it is an advertisement.
Okay. I also definitely detect in myself the irony of that I, of all people, quoting this as a person who once worked at Vice, the birthplace of branded content, and also host of a podcast with at least 2 advertorials per broadcast.
From native.
Well, actually, I think we indicate very clearly when you have an ad. So there's music is put underneath. So it's not nativer than nativer than native. I don't know. It stays in my head, this video. And
it's just such a big and important conversation anyway, right? Which we also feel a lot. We do relate to those ads as well. And we also do know what people feel about that we do. But I also think every time, and I also mention this regularly, because of that, we can offer this podcast for free. We can also not do it, but then we go behind a paywall. And of course, that's the same somewhere at DPG. They also need those advertisers to exist. I bought a newspaper the other day. On a Saturday, I bought NRC.
Yes.
35,
do I also have
so
every
expensive.
weekend that I think, gosh, it's gotten expensive.
Hasn't it? Really expensive. And of course, that's also because those advertisers are walking away, so they have those...
Yeah, but you think at that amount, you just want an ad-free newspaper.
To get behind a paywall. Yeah, exactly. But you see, they need those advertisers too. And apparently this is a way to get them to...
No, definitely. And I understand too. I'm also certainly not against ads in a newspaper, and also nothing against branded content in a newspaper. Just write newspapers like Volkskrant, NRC, Reductional are going to talk about that there are kind of sickly separate walls there that
Paul,
never...
Yes, now boast about that, because I would find that really rich, because also if you look at that NRC magazine and stuff, that's...
I think there are very fierce opinions about that on the editorial boards. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so too. But apparently then the opinion of...
But so that's what I think...
Still wins. Because if you look at that magazine, you really think half of it is just sneak advertising.
I don't know either. I also don't know what now the conclusion of this piece in...
Well, I think it's both... look, it's both understandable. It's understandable that they want to attract those advertisers with such a story of its native. I get it. Yes, it's sleazy, but I get it. And I also think it's good that the hiring manager then expresses that again.
Yeah, but can you... I just think then of... You can do it anyway. Surely you can just make it attractive with original angles. And do mention that it's an advertorial. Clear.
But of course it always says that.
Is always mentioned, but just say the ways it is. It's very much pushing the limit.
And personally, I always find the ads really the best. I never have that, I think. Gee, what an interesting article about chairs I'm reading.
Then again, that's because they've separated those departments, because the real creativity is obviously not there, you know. So I think let those people think about that approach, but state more clearly that it's just a commercial message. So just communicate it more whole purpose like us. So just put a music under it.
Yeah, put MC Prax in front of it and you're done.
Speaking of which, we're going to an advertorial. Hinge is the dating app with the slogan designed to be deleted. So you use it temporarily. The unique thing about Hinge are the prompt, which we also talked about in the previous episode. Prompts are questions you can put on your profile, making it extremely easy to start a fun conversation and immediately get an idea of someone's personality. We're going to try out another prompt. This week's prompt, green flags, what we're looking for.
Yes.
We came upon a good
green flag day. Well, you have a quote like that from an author or something. And he once said if you get to someone's home and they don't have books, don't fuck them. I actually think that's very good advice anyway. And then what I would add to that tip myself is also look at what books. So which books? I could have saved myself a lot of hassle if once, for example, I had taken it more seriously, that someone I got to know as his last book read, which he was also very sincerely, very enthusiastic about, called The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck.
Good philosophical masterpiece.
Yes, so that's a red flag wrapped up as a green flag then.
Yeah. But I do think the nuance is important. You have to link the books together.
Yes.
Because you also find every human being changes. Every person deserves to read bad books and then move on.
Yeah, so you may also, in a grey past, that kind of self may as well.
Be very nice of what's funny. This person went from that book to this book.
Yes. But then you have to ask again, because you never know how the progression...
And that's like a fun conversation and kind of reconstructing someone's personal development through books.
A fun prompt on Hinge.
Prompt it away and download Hinge now via iOS or Android. We've wanted to talk about expats for a long time. We think there is a changing attitude toward expats. Actually, it seems like expats are kind of eliminating the local characters of our cities, if you were to put it. And that's also the most important thing about this scheme, is that the only condition is income related. It's not about what you can do, it's about how much you earn. So we also had a little chat with our listeners of why then do you think this 30% rule should be abolished? Well, then you get pretty clear answers. They are already rich enough. The experts in this, or indeed what you say, they should really only apply to some sectors. So maybe of sectors that we do indeed need more knowledge migration on. But then, for example, IT not, because we may already have enough Scrum Masters here. And a lot of people also find that limit unfair. In that respect, we also came from far away. Because at first we were very internationally oriented or something. We thought anything that came from abroad was exotic and exciting. We talked about it once before in an episode. I think you literally had that yourself. Like, I've been to places. I brought a piece of New York with me to Amsterdam. That mosquito then made us feel a little mundane and international. With that need also fits expats. They also make the city more international. English is spoken a lot.
And at one time, we thought that was cool, too. I do remember that naval area that then became a kind of, what do they call it, sort of an international coding hub or something. And we thought that was pretty cool or something as a municipality. I think if we introduced that now, we'd all be lying flat on that property. Don't touch our land. Stop coding.
Yes, and hubs, too. But anyway, those expats, of course, also made our economic competitiveness stronger. We liked that too, as a society. And in return, they gave pretty big tax breaks. And maybe that's where this whole egg-eating thing started. Maybe that's why that attitude also started to change a little bit. Because now we seem to be in some tougher economic weather.
Yeah, and kind of in the hangover days of all those kind of neoliberal measures, I guess. Seem to find them more and more irritating. Yes, certainly. And we have, we're going to investigate. Yes, we've done research again. We've talked to recruiters, experts themselves, listeners, and we even interviewed an MEP, Paul Tang, on those issues. He'll be speaking later in this episode. And yes, we actually asked them from, is that negative sentiment? Do you actually experience that? So where does that come from? And we also, so again, our listeners to the teeth on this topic. Yes, 1,500 respondents. Yeah. And we actually initially just asked the question of, yes, what do you think of experts, more or less? And turned out that was pretty divided. So 33% think experts enrich the city. 31% don't find experts an enrichment of the city. And 36% are neutral. Well, then we went on to ask from, so why do you find experts not an enrichment? So why are you annoyed by experts, in other words? And then actually one that you heard by far the most was house prices. So the idea is really experts make everything more expensive. And I live in a very expensive house because of those experts. And then also something they often heard was of, yeah, they're really just consuming, but they don't add anything to the city. They don't learn the language. There are too many of them. Someone said, You can't call them knowledge migrants anymore because they're just failed Scrum Masters from booking. Well, I think it's a concrete articulation of something a lot of people do think, consciously or unconsciously. Somebody also said, you just have to take packages for them, and otherwise they look through you.
That's how it went. Also, well, all the things that aren't just for expats.
Just wanted to say, that also applied to a lot of people just living in those cities, I guess. You heard a lot also of they don't contribute an authentic character of the city. And then again, I thought that was, Sander Schiebel, we've mentioned him before, had a column a while back about that there is quite a line to be drawn between the anti-expat sentiment and the anti-AZC sentiment, say, in smaller communities. And I thought this was a good example, because then it's all at once about an authentic character of the city that expats would not contribute to.
That's just a xenophobic statement. Yeah, that's
pretty xenophobic. And that I also thought, for example, a city like Amsterdam has always been a city where a lot of migrants come to live, where in a sense in the time of the Dutch East India Company, a lot of expats have been living here as well. So when it comes to authenticity, I don't know if you can make that very well.
Well,
no, I also have to say that it's very controversial if you had that said on a flight. No, definitely, because we also get someone talking later who gets called out in town for pussy expat, which was also mentioned a lot. And there's another nice round there anyway, with my earlier idea, their dogs are not raised.
There a solution?
We know where they have to go. Well, then we had the reasons why people find it benign. Expats in the city, well, some easy reasons. It brings diversity. It's more international. It's good for the economy, more knowledge. And a lot of people also turned out have an expat as a partner. By the way, we hope that we can also, in English as well, that's an AI translation. That would be nice.
There they can listen too.
Then we asked, are you friends with expats? Also because, of course, it's kind of, that prejudice is of expats. Don't mix with the city. Well, actually turned out to be quite a bit. 45% said yes. 55% said no. And then the hot topic was the tax break for expats. That 30% provision. Of that said, it was the question, or do you think that tax break should be butchered? Then 65% said yes, 8% said no, and then there was 26% who didn't know of that tax break. So what that rule means, because quite a few people don't know what it is workers from abroad are required under conditions on up to 30% of their wages, do not have to pay taxes. And there has been friction about that regulation. Because yes, it is quite unfair. That just some of the people who often already earn a lot, so over a large portion of their income to pay, while they do live here, so you could say, wow, they also use the things paid for by taxes. And now recently, a year ago, I believe, the period for which this rule has already been reduced from 8 to 5 years.
Yes.
So there's already some grumbling about that. So we also spent some time, talked to our listeners of, so why do you think that this 30% rule should be abolished? Well, then you get pretty clear answers. They're already rich enough, the experts on this, or indeed what you say, they should really only for some sectors. So maybe of sectors where we do indeed need more knowledge migration on, but then not IT, for example, because we may have enough Scrum Masters here. And a lot of people find that boundary also unfair. So that €240,000 limit, and I can really only do that with 2.
Yes. And before we dive further into that then, it's good to have a very small semantic discussion about the term expat, because officially it means something different than how we actually use it a little bit in our language. The word expat comes from the Latin words ex and patria, outside homeland, and designates anyone who does not reside in their native country, actually. But the Vandal says an expat is someone who is abroad for an extended period of time, especially an employee who is stationed abroad in an internationally opining organization. So someone who is sent by a booking office abroad to a booking office in Amsterdam, and not someone who moves from Uber to booking in Amsterdam. So in the same company, actually. But we actually use that term for anyone who comes to work here and just finds a job in the Netherlands, and especially in those higher regions. So actually these are knowledge migrants. So people who migrate highly educated immigrant, actually. For example, teachers they used to be, or scientific researchers.
Well, I'm also just thinking, for example, I studied philosophy, and actually all those professors and university professors were German. Yes. But I would never say that's an expert. No, that isn't. Yes, but I just have the idea that the expert is also kind of, it's just kind of, what do you call it? A caricature, righty? Became at some point. Because indeed, for example, those teachers, the ones in my study, they also, of course, mixed a lot with Dutch people and so on. And I think our image of experts are just indeed Americans who just think it's nice to live here. And just hanging out at the Swedish embassy or something. Or picking you up with an expensive dog.
For the rest of the episode, we're actually going to use a slightly broader definition than the classic expat. We say expat, but we mean a mixture of knowledge migrants and the classic expat. So highly educated people from outside the Netherlands who have a good income and don't necessarily intend to settle here so permanently.
Yes, I think that's very important. Also, that last one.
Yes, exactly. Because for that group is also the 30% rule. Because that is also...
temporary. Yes, exactly. A temporary arrangement. Yes. And I think, so I also a little bit into where does all this negative sentiment coming from? Which I think is indeed by a lot of people. And I think there are several reasons for that.
My experience personally is dual. So on the one hand, say on a personal level, I found them irritating quite often. Yes. Why? Yes, because... So they just didn't make any effort to learn Dutch. Nobody who worked there at all consider a course in Dutch or anything like that. Yes. And that need...
it's also a language that you really no use at all.
I always have to think about when people always tend, when you're talking to someone who stutters, to start finishing those sentences. You shouldn't do that then. You should then. So you then have to take your time with that. That's actually with expats trying to speak Dutch as well. Yes. Because everyone just talks back in English, so it doesn't really inspire to actually learn Dutch. Yes, but I always found that to be a bit of a rigid rigidity or something. Also sometimes condescending towards Dutch culture, but then as an employer I found them totally super.
What then? Yes.
Well, first of all, they feel like it because they moved all the way to work. So they tend to be very ambitious. They're very focused on that work, so you get a lot out of them. They're usually not the mediocre people who make such a big move for work. So if you don't care that much at all, why go to another country? They are very ambitious. Yes, they are focused on work.
Of that choice. Yes, they are.
Meaningful cultural perspective. Yes, because you just get, anyway, in my case, the product was creativity. You just get better ideas when different cultures are looking at something than if it's an all-Dutch team. So from that kind of employer perspective, I thought they made a lot of sense.
So you understand in that sense, actually that 30% arrangement as well. Yeah.
I'm also in favor of the 30% rule under much stricter conditions.
Oh, exciting, Berg. We'll talk about it later.
Okay. We also thought it was important to take a look at what we're talking about. Because when it comes to those expats, in any of the big cities in the Netherlands, people can sometimes feel like, oh, we're really flooded with expats. Well, just how many are there? An estimated 200,000 expats live in the Netherlands. And of those, 50 to 100,000 live in the Amsterdam region. That's quite...
Okay, we thought it was important to take a look at what we're talking about. Because when it comes to those expats, right, in any of the big cities in the Netherlands, people can sometimes feel like, oh, we're really flooded with expats. Well, just how many are there? An estimated 200,000 expats live in the Netherlands. And of those, 50 to 100,000 in the Amsterdam region. That's pretty well constructed. And then another 60,000 live in The Hague. The number of expats is growing fast, though. Of course, that applies to immigration anyway. But it also applies to immigration figures. So there are also moving a lot of people from the Netherlands. Logical. Also, yeah, I feel like they leave their mark on the city a lot more than maybe just that everyone is always gossiping about them. So Amstelveen is still, I'm just saying, so if you're annoyed by expats in Amsterdam, go to Amstelveen sometime.
What was striking is that compared to many other European countries, we do very little
outside
expats.
of Gelderland, that really struck me. This time we really need to put on our socials, because I really think but anyway, I'll get into that later. But in the Randstad, there is so much complaining about those expats.
Yes.
Go to Ireland sometime, it's only a problem there. Or Luxembourg. Hardly any native people live there anymore. And Switzerland a lot too. So it's really... And we're right at the bottom. Only Finland has fewer expats.
So we, of the mainly Western European countries, we really dangle at the bottom, while indeed, again, our feeling is that we're really swamped with expat.
Because when you talk about expats, you're talking mostly, to my mind, about a sentiment. I feel that Amsterdammers and Randstadelingen have the idea that expats make the city a city for the rich, and meanwhile it is entirely questionable whether that is so. Because those expats, of course, are not personally responsible for the policies that led to them being here. And also that the benefits are there that they take advantage of. And I mentioned briefly, Sander Schimmelpenninck had a good column on that earlier this year, in which he compared that sentiment to an anti-refugee sentiment, which is more prevalent outside the Randstad. I didn't agree with that whole column, but I did think he did a good job of pointing the finger at the scare, because of course it's not the expats who have made the city into a kind of liberal tax haven. These are often also, for example, Dutch people who live here and buy a second home, which they then rent out through Airbnb. And when that was no longer allowed for a high rent to expats. Yes, things like that. And expats don't know our housing market either. They're in a hurry, they need a house. They often have no choice at all. So yes, they will pay a high rent for a house, while you could also say that they might prefer to pay a lower rent. So I have the idea that we are actually very much pointing at expats as a kind of culprit and also causer of all our capitalist problems.
That the system is actually much...
Yes, and that we actually don't want to look at ourselves there, because a lot of people in the Randstad found it chill too, to rent through Airbnb, for example, and also quite relaxed that Uber came here and also used there a lot. And then Uber here in office, then all at once it's from, or booking.com. Yes, the tourists did get to come and eat at your restaurant through booking.com and not just spend money, but then booking.com will build an office here. Then at once, then we don't like it all that much anymore.
So I found in that regard that the municipality also advertises in other cities, in cities outside the Netherlands, with that kind of position of actually with the problems that it's about. So particularly the housing crisis. That is actually the source for how the Netherlands, and in this case, in particular Amsterdam, is advertised. There's a Bishock ad in London that says, when you realize it's monthly rent, not weekly.
Yes, because of course for a Londoner, Amsterdam is a wonderfully cheap little town to live there. And you see that also in Amsterdam. So there's a whole brokerage economy built up around those expats. So you can actually think, okay,
Yes.
Are the expats then the culprits in, for example, this idea of those higher rents? Or is it just the real estate guys from Amsterdam or from The Hague driving through town on their Felix and thinking, oh, there's another one of those? Or in this
case, just the city.
Yes, and the city itself. So it's just a lot more diffuse than that. It's all the fault of those guys working at Booking. I myself had written a column in the Volkskrant the other day about the emergence of the disappearance of the middle class. Also because of the globalization of the economy, and that you actually get a kind of upper class and a kind of lower class because a lot of people also can't pay that rent anymore. And so in that, I had written myself of, because of the expats, the rents are driven up, that editorial board is really going to thumb its fingers at me. That's just not hard. That's not hard to get. We also talked to some economists about that before this episode. And they also say, the thing is, when it comes to those rents or those high housing prices, everybody wants to assign blame, but you can't actually say exactly because of expats, rents are getting higher.
Nice of that editor-in-chief to pull that out then.
Extracts, yeah, sure. That's what they're there for too.
Yes, but that's free anyway. Yes, I always have the idea that editor-in-chief is mainly on.
That's because they earn so much through those advertorials with DPG. That's really super good. Yes, and I
Kim's account beyond their title
found
goes.
Thijs Niemans Verdriet, who has long written for, I think still wrote about Amsterdam for NRC, who had quite a good article the other day. It was about the Amsterdam attachments that NRC had for a long time. And that was from the 2013, had that existed. And then he sort of went on to show a little bit, what those attachments were about then. Actually, he then saw very much the sentiment emerging that led to this globalization, to attract expats. That they thought it was all fucking nice, that people
Exciting.
who worked for Google wanted to come and live here and so on. And just that comparison too that he says of, yes, Airbnb, which we thought was a really nice, fresh phenomenon from America. And we were going to experiment a little bit with that in the city. We were going to do a little bit of those flash movers, those share scooters, a little bit of events and festivals we found enriching. I really liked that too. And what was also very nice is that he quoted a cover from 2013 over North, which then said, the new center, and the word gentrification wasn't mentioned at all. So what he did very well was to show that actually in the last 10 years, a lot of measures have been taken by the city as well. But also, for example, that people could start sharing houses at once. You know, that as a student, for example, you could go with several students, could start living in a house instead of one or two people. Those kinds of measures, that were embraced then.
Yeah,
but of
those
course,
all
those
have
now lead to
unintended
people
effects.
at 35 still living with roommates because they just can't afford it all anymore.
Whereas actually, if you introduce that measure at that time, you actually have a kind of blueprint of what the effects of that measure are in the form of London, New York.
Well, exactly. But of course, that's what we at that time all didn't think about. And that with also those expats as part to a city that is just unaffordable for a lot of people.
I think it's really a crazy idea if you introduce something like that and you know that there are just all kinds of cases all over the world where that happened 10 years ago and where that led to something. So how can you not think about that?
Yes, if you have a liberal town hall. Look, and the same, of course, applies to that 30% rule. The moment that's instituted, a lot of people may still be thinking, well, that's great, because then a lot of smart people will come to this city and they're going to enrich the city tremendously. But all those things together will create a city where people feel like the ground is under their feet and they're being competed away as a result.
Yes, and that's actually what I was saying earlier. In essence, I'm all for us improving the competitiveness of the country. This scheme is designed to do that. It's just how it's handled. That's the problem. Because it only looks at an income test and not at what kind of unique talent that person actually has that cannot be found here. As a result, all sorts of scrum masters are imported who are just fine here.
With expensive dogs.
Yes, or I don't know many people optimizing ads at Booking. Yeah. Again, that's kind of so logical. If you're just going to test it on income that's going to happen, you would say.
Yeah, and we talked to somebody who is also concerned about that, like you, like me, Paul Tang. Actually, since the beginning of this podcast, I feel very much the need to invite Paul Tang out sometime. I find every time I see him on Newsweek or being interviewed somewhere else, I think that man is really doing important things. Need to answer him. Yeah. And just, I also often think with that European Parliament of get to it, such an incredibly unwieldy machine. But this Labour politician is really busy with very good things there, I think. And we interviewed him for this episode. And he actually totally agrees with you when it comes to that 30% rule. That's just not a good measure of talent. And therefore, not a good measure of what the city needs. We're going to listen for a moment.
You give a grant, that in itself poses a problem because there may be people in the same position where one gets a tax break and another does not. Then you have to have a good reason for that. And that reason could be that the expert who came through that arrangement has something of a benefactor. You have benefits for this country that don't happen to that company, but that in a broad sense benefit the Netherlands. I don't think such people are benefactors at all. So I think the one who benefits from it is the expert himself and the company he wants to work alongside. So in return for that public subsidy, there is actually no social benefit. Functions that are very hard to fill, that are very special, that are very essential to the NLC economy, they don't do that much. So actually just a lot of experts can use that expert rule.
And what Paul Tang also mentioned was that he's actually starting to worry about what he then calls a race to the bottom effect. So basically that all EU countries, to attract as many rich expats as possible, because expats, of course, are also very good for the economy, that they're all going to kind of pick on each other. And it's all about those tax benefits. So that's why the Netherlands doesn't want to abolish it, because they say, yeah, then they'll all go to someone else.
Is the example of Rutte and Shell after all?
So yes, in summary, Paul Tang would, and I think that's a pretty good idea, actually want to make some kind of joint agreement with the entire EU Commission on how to approach the expat policy and what benefits you do and don't give, and to whom it should and shouldn't
I honestly
apply.
don't think it is
Then you
so
get rid of that
greenst and important for the European economy. In fact, I think there are many more factors that are important to knowledge workers, for example, and specific knowledge to pull them out. But again, the European Parliament is pressed on it somewhat possibly. I assume that the European Commission does come up with a proposal at some point. I don't think just to actually have that decision. And you can only see that that battle has ignited a lot more in the last few years. So at the Tax Case Committee in the European Parliament, actually that last year, 2 years, we are really warned about a new race to the bottom. Certainly if everybody does it, then it turns out that that makes no sense, and we have actually just collectively become poorer and have no benefit. I think I would like the European Commission to come up with an initiative to curb this. On what conditions such a scheme would have to do, and so normally it is much more limited than it is now. For example, the conditions to this kind of regulation or a generic injunction, I frankly don't think it's self-important to the European economy. In fact, I think there are many more factors that are important to knowledge workers, for example, and specific knowledge to pull them out. But again, in the European Parliament, there is some possible push for it. And I assume that the European Commission will come up with a proposal here at its own time to start limiting this. I think that's just all that discussion indeed also really to have, because we should not bury our heads in the sand. This is a growing problem. I see that in Amsterdam, my oldest wife can fuss about how can I live here in my own city. That is a sentiment, but also a concern back, and you see that too. I was visiting Dublin, where a lot, especially big tech companies, have set up shop. You can see that in the city. We are also very flexible. There showed a survey of young people up to the years or 20, between the years or 18 and 20, that 70% of those young people between the years or 18 and 20 are thinking about leaving Ireland because they have no place to live there, especially in Dublin, but also in other cities. We can take Amsterdam as an example. Because in Dublin, if you walk around there, you see the buildings of Google, Facebook, TikTok, and so on. That obviously has a huge impact on that city. And on top of that, public housing in Ireland is very limited and very poor. Yes, the problems there are perhaps even greater than in Amsterdam. Yes, of course, that has an impact.
Yes, to me, that issue of those expats is also much more directly related to our obsession with that climate for settlement. Of course, we are a small country, and we have always in history been concerned with how can we strengthen our trading position. And the way we deal with that establishment climate is another example of that. We've been extremely welcoming. We just don't let people pay taxes.
Sort of economic FOMOs of all these companies need to locate here can all just not pay taxes. It's really just a tax haven within the EU.
And we bought into it. Because look, however you know it, that did work. Because Nike is also here, Uber is also here, Booking is also here. All those companies do sit here, only you can't go back. You once gave them that deal, And you can now, if you screw up the rates now, they say yes.
But you can also see that sentiment is also changing anyway. Because, of course, there was also a lot of discussion about the tax break for those big companies. And then Rutte indeed said something like, I had the idea that quite a few Dutch people, well, they'll leave, won't they?
But that's such a sentiment. Only until, look, Boking, to make it local. Boking is the largest employer in Amsterdam. So if they were to leave, coincidentally, it is originally a Dutch company, maybe that's more difficult. But if they leave, then the largest employer in the city will leave. There are a lot of expats among them, but also a lot of Amsterdammers.
Well, and it's purchasing power too. A very big economic hit to the city. So then the gut feeling of fuck off with Booking. But yeah, then when there are 7,000 layoffs all at once or something, I don't know exactly how many people work there, but a very large group, yes, then I think that opinion is also going to be different. And the 30% rule, that is actually part of the establishment climate. Because if they are established here, then they should also be able to get the top talent here. And that's another negotiating position, right? If you're here, but it's very difficult to get your top talent here, then why would you even sit here? So I think those two things are much more connected. There, I very much agree with Paul Tang that we have to have European agreements on that so that it's not like, yes, why should I sit there when I can sit in Dublin? There, I do have that 30%.
But they're doing that now. Now there are these bids. Some of these companies also just let you pitch as a city. So then you say, okay, we're going to go here or here. Just do a pitch. And then Amsterdam will actually pitch. Dublin too. And whoever gives the best conditions, that's where the company goes. So I definitely think it makes sense to just create a kind of level playing field in that at the European level. And before we talk about what to do with this situation, with all these expats, let's talk about something that is also very important, namely what to have for dinner tonight. Because we still have a sponsor in the form of the meal boxes from Green Chef. Green Chef helps you eat healthy your way. A healthy meal box that fits your lifestyle perfectly. With Green Chef, you choose each time from a selection of the bilious recipes. There is something for every healthy lifestyle. Vegan, vegetarian, keto. You decide which of 3, 4, or 5 healthy dishes will sit down at your house. And this week, I ate vegan lasagna with homemade bechamel sauce.
Jeez.
With a little mushrooms on the side and a panko crisp. What is a panko crisp? Don't ask me. I'm an incredible amateur chef.
But made your own bechamel sauce? I think so.
That was pretty easy with the help of Green Chef. That panko crisp was very crispy. How?
Great. And also ate a lot of vegetables. Because with Green Chef, getting plenty of vegetables on your plate is a piece of cake. Each dish contains a minimum of 250 grams of vegetables per person. And that's exactly the daily vegetable allowance. Of course, this is not a coincidence, but it is very convenient. Cook healthy with up to 90 euros off your first 4 boxes. With the unique code Chef Shameless. I'll repeat it again. It is Chef Shameless. With only capital letters and together. And of course, you'll find the link in our show notes.
Next?
Yes, let's get to that. I would say after this conversation, after the interview with Paul Tang, after the reactions of listeners, a less vehement anti-expert sentiment and a broader zoomed out awareness of where the expats are coming from, now what policies have been behind them and what the consequences of that policy have been. And thus also a kind of wake-up call, like perhaps to advocate sort of a policy around how we organize the city, what measures we take, and with that also looking at what effect that might have on the future.
Especially that. I've really been so puzzled by some of those things that I read. I can Google you what happens when you implement this. Especially that is what sticks with me. Other than that, everything you say I totally agree with. But I am curious whether you would abolish that 30% rule or not.
I would abolish it for those income tax. So I find that really bizarre because that's just a perverse incentive for people who are already making a lot of money to come here and make even more money, while they're not actually potentially adding super much. What's already here in terms of workers? I mean, scrumming, plenty of Dutch people can do that too, so to speak.
We demonize. Yes, there are scrum masters
So
in
scrummers
this
we
episode.
did lose after this episode. But I do think there is obviously a need for a lot of other knowledge, though. And you could maybe get about another 30% regulation on that. And if, for example, certain companies or institutions or universities or whatever could just hardwire, because we have a great need for this kind of knowledge.
Can you do that in a commercial context as well? So that a professor, I get that. But is there also 30% regulation for people at commercial companies? For example, when you talk about programmers, a skill that is in short supply here, would those then apply to you as future 30% recipients?
Yes, what a confrontational question. So at the end of the episode, yes, what would I say? Yes, it might.
The time has come when we are in complete agreement on a subject like this.
Yes, but it is a doubt up.
Now I say that.
No. What? No, I don't want me to bash it in with you. Look, I think you just have to draw a line somewhere. So you can't then say it's not allowed for commercial businesses, because then you get into a semantic discussion of, what is commercial, you know? So I would put it then for anything
that's
with a
kind of
profit motive.
noticed. For me, it's I find those incomes, if that's done in it, I also find completely perverse and also just stupid. But I do support strengthening that competitive position internationally. So I'm actually for that 30% arrangement under other conditions, which is much more about
quantitative rather than quantitative. Yes.
Those parameters should be on talent and on addition to the economy.
Well, vote for us.
Vote VSR.
In your next municipal elections.
I like that we agree on the whole moment. Nice.
Nice. Do you think our friends from Komeet, how are they?
In terms of knowledge migrants,
are still acidic, this knowledge?
They go, since we developed the cookie with them, they go sky high in terms of ambition level. We have opened their eyes.
That's the VSR?
They are going to open 2 new branches, and they are doing a crowdfunding for that. We wanted to give them a little bit of a boost, a little sort of 30% arrangement in their back.
They're also opening on Navy property, I saw, exactly, right in the middle, in the King's Hub.
Right in the middle of the Koning Hub. And on the NISM site, also a kind of cradle of expats.
Also in Amsterdam North, we say there, exactly.
Exactly. But they're doing a crowdfunding, and we hope they're going to pull it off. And that's why we promised to mention this as well.
It's also a good way to work around that kind of 30% arrangement of those crowdfundings.
And to get a connection with local culture.
Also, expats.
Join the crowdfunding.
Yes, exactly. If you guys read this episode all the way through in English, show how important you find your own...
That's how it is.
That's right. Newsstand. See you next week. Bye.
En, heb je jouw €10 startegoed al ontvangen in de Peaks-app? Peaks beweegt mee met je leven. Zo kun je op elk moment extra inleggen of je geld opnemen. Wel zo handig. Gebruik actiecode PEAKS10. Beleggen kent risico's. Je kunt je inleg verliezen.